welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Since you're here, please like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share the video so that more people get to know about us. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive information. If you like our content, please contribute to keep it alive. A small contribution that you make will be a giant leap for us to keep bringing you this content. Let me also inform you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center, your one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. And I will be starting live big picture current affairs classes from the 10th of this month. So don't miss the chance to interact with me. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com and register right now. Hundreds are reaping the benefits of the Knowledge Center. Don't be left behind. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. Well, on to the discussion now. Meeting in person for the first time in 2 years, G20 leaders had a full agenda, including climate change, the COVID pandemic, a landmark tax deal, and global economy worries. Leaders committed to the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, pledged action against dirty coal plants, but fell short on a target of zero emissions. They put their seal of approval on an agreement that will subject multinationals to a minimum 15% tax as part of an effort to build a more stable and fairer international tax system. Leaders also vowed to support the WHO's goal of vaccinating at least 40% of the world's population by 2021 and 70% by the middle of next year by boosting the supply of vaccines in developing countries and removing supply and financing constraints. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the key highlights from the G20 summit. Joining me on the program today are Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, Vivek Karju, former ambassador, and Sheetal Sharma of the School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. Let's analyze, the key takeaways, key highlights, and what you think of the Rome Declaration.
Look, before we come to the declaration, let me say a word on how I am looking at G20 now. G20 is not a monolith. And I see the schisms that are coming up in G20 to be very significant. And these schisms are robbing the G20 of opportunities for common, shared, and joint action. And this is not only will, but is manifesting itself in the decisions of the G20, howsoever they may try to paper over the cracks. But in their decisions on vital issues like dealing with the pandemic, dealing with dealing with climate change, with economic inequities, with the management of international financial institutions. Because I'm mentioning this, and in fact, I'd like to emphasize this because we know that there is nothing known as pure economics, that politics intrudes into everything just as economics intrudes into politics. So that, I think, is something that we need to keep at the back of our mind when we approach any declaration that the G20 has made. And I mention this particularly because if other world leaders could come in person for this meeting, I see no reason why Putin and Xi Jinping kept away. And quite clearly, their keeping away sends a message. And the message is clear. And the message is that the world is gone into power blocks again. And we are facing a kind of Cold War, which is manifesting itself in all areas of international politics and economics. So I've said this because I think this is the kind of a background that we must keep in mind before we try to assess the G20 declaration.
Absolutely. Sheetal Sharma, let me bring you to the picture now. As far as you are concerned, what are those three big highlights or takeaways for you from the G20 summit?
Frank, I fully endorse what Ambassador Saab said, that what kind of dealings are happening or what kind of, issues are being discussed in G20. But we have to also keep in mind the global framework within which all these are operating. If you talk about the three key takeaways from this, is one is certainly the global minimum tax regime. The second one is climate and energy. And the third one we'll talk about is pandemic and health security. Now, all these things are interrelated. And why I say so, that Sir was saying that it's a kind of Cold War, but the Cold War is of a different type now. It's no longer having that concentrated two power blocks. Power blocks or divisions are there, but then the single power domination is no longer there, number one, because you cannot claim either Russia or China to be a power this side or even US. Now, why this has happened? Because in the last 2 years particularly, and it can be extended to 10 years down the line also, many things have undergone transformation, and two of the most important things which are important and they have reshaped the global dynamics is, one is US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the second one I would say is the virus, which is the needle of suspicion always going towards China. In both the cases, both these rival powers, if we can say as a third person here, both these rival powers, because US considers China to be a rival power, both have taken a beating to their image. US because of Afghanistan and China because of virus. And suddenly all other powers, I would say the middle powers or the smaller nations or the other members of the G20, which were, you cannot call them as very heavyweight, but everybody has now, come into that on a platform where there are shifting kind of relationships and dynamics between countries. So these two important events, Afghanistan event and pandemic, they have actually opened up a large number of questions about even the power and the dominance of these two entities. And then what has happened? Because of China, somehow even US for that matter can wash off its hands in Afghanistan by saying that, they had to at one point of the time in future had to withdraw. But this virus has given the entire global community a kind of reason to unite against China because of the, irrespective of whatever or wherever they are located, because of one or the other reason or resentment that they had against China. Some as security issues, some as border issues, some considering it as a rival power, some people fed up with China in South China Sea. All these people have come together, but somehow Russia is a game in between, neither this side nor this side, because sometimes we see Russia having a Eurasian dream or aligning more with Western powers in some of the areas, but at the same time being a communist regime, more inclined towards or gravitated towards China and the communist form of governance. So what is this? A kind of chaos in which we are talking about G20 and we are talking about issues like climate change and pandemic, particularly global tax can still be seen as an important takeaway, but the two most important ones, I would say, one is to deal with the health infrastructure and another climate, which we'll discuss later on.
Absolutely. Pramit, let me bring you to the picture now. Let's go back to a point that the ambassador was making in his opening remarks about, the cracks from within the G20 itself. And what are the equations like right now? And, are smaller internal issues trying to destabilize the bigger picture?
Well, G20 summits normally struggle and have been struggling since the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which was the last major one in which you saw all the members of the G20 come together, largely to respond to the global financial crisis. Since then, G20 have anyway been relatively, should we say, not particularly good in responding in a coherent fashion to major international problems. The two big ones, obviously, that others have mentioned have been the pandemic as well as climate. The pandemic, the G20, we've already seen that health responses have been highly fragmented and driven almost completely by very strong national interests, because when people are dying in your own country, governments really don't have the capacity to provide too much to other countries, as we saw even in India, where we had to give up exporting vaccines for a while during the second wave. So the G20 there at least has come to an agreement on vaccines production, and we should start to see that taking place on a large scale, but it really was putting its imprimatur on something that was already slowly taking place. though even there you can see, and there India has been leading the way, that the acceptance of vaccine certificates issued by different countries, by other countries, continues to be a major hindrance, and that somehow has to be settled. But that's going to be an issue because domestic regulatory problems, plus some geopolitical differences, Chinese vaccines and Russian vaccines in particular, the West has openly refused to accept. So you have that element of it, that the world can live with that. We could have two sort of spheres of vaccine certification with a sort of overlap in countries in between. Climate, however, is much more difficult. And there the divisions are not all that very clear, in the sense that it isn't just a geopolitical one. It's obviously an equity issue where the difference between the North and the South. Climate, the countries like India are economically, and our energy profile is much closer to that of China than it is to, let's say, Western countries, which have a much larger renewable and gas and nuclear capacity or percentage than we do. But there's an additional factor there, which is largely a future economic problem, which is that as you're looking at a lot of these so-called legacy industries, so you talk to people in the Indian government, they say oil is basically now a sunset industry. Nobody wants to invest in this industry anymore. Coal is a sunset industry. We can no longer get investment into these sectors, not just internationally, but even domestically. Companies and investors are saying we're not investing in coal. But we need to keep that investment cycle going because we have to transition out. But there's a further issue of that. Who is going to dominate the green technologies that follow? Who are going to be the next electrical vehicle manufacturers, the lithium ion battery supply chains? Where will they dominate? Where will they come from? Right. And that is a battle that goes back to things that you can see in the Quad, for example, where a whole host of the technology alliances that the Quad is building, or similar ones that China is developing, are effectively trying to develop a completely different post-hydrocarbon economy, but in two separate spheres. So that's another division that you're seeing, and it's looking at really who's going to dominate the future technologies of the 21st century.
Absolutely. Ambassador, coming back to you now, let me take another aspect forward with you. So what does all of this mean for multilateral groupings? Have nations now, are they beginning to understand that there is no utility in multilaterals and they're focusing more on bilaterals?
Look, the picture is very complex at the moment. Sheetalji correctly said that the Cold War situation can't be replicated. I think that was what was her basic argument, and I agree with that. But it can't be replicated because the world is no longer in the analog age; it's in the digital age, and there are the compulsions of the digital age, which require far greater cooperation, despite the differences and fundamental differences of the different parts. Yet, these differences are complicating issues and making multilateralism extremely difficult. On approaches where there should be a unified thing, like climate change, and Pramit is right, climate has always been about power. If you look at how the West has behaved right from 1992, reneging on each and every of their commitments, start with the whole concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, the magic formula, and how they, from there, 3 decades later, no one even talks about it. You just think of the iniquities, and that is because they did not anticipate that the Chinese would rise the way they did. They didn't even anticipate that India would grow the way it has. So, given these complexities, I think multilateralism is becoming more complex. But is there a substitute for it? I don't think so. Let's take the response to the pandemic. It has not been ideal, but quite frankly, unless there is a coordinating role played by a particular agency, whether it's the WHO or whatever, WHO went through a cloud, and rightly so, because I think the initial response was terribly irresponsible. But they have come back and come back strongly. And I think even there are grave doubts at the moment, because the way they behaved with our own vaccine is shocking. We don't know, quite frankly, why is certification of Covaxin being held up. They say that they will not cut corners. After all, they owe a responsibility to everyone to say what, if any, what do they find lacking in this vaccine, which we believe and our authorities believe. And as an Indian, I would trust our authorities completely. They believe this vaccine is safe. Crores of people have been vaccinated with it. We've given it abroad. The WHO did not say that don't export it to other countries. So I think these are issues, practical issues, which require to be addressed in a more coherent manner. And my last point here, Frank, is while the G20, and I think correctly has said that there has to be a minimum corporate tax, I'm not quite sure how this will be implemented. I've always believed that the great companies of the world, the multinationals of the world, and the way they ingress into political systems always find ways of manipulating these things, especially on taxation. So I, for one, will hold my horses on this. The first barrier it will face will be the US Congress itself. We know how the US Congress operates. So on that, I have question marks. And my very last point is on trade. Let's face it, whatever we may say about the future for the present and for some time to come, the Chinese are in a very, very strong position. We all talk of global supply chains and resilient supply chains. But is it not a fact that despite all the troubles we've had with China, in the last year and a half, our trade and our imports from China has grown? What does that show?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Points well taken, Ambassador. Let me take the discussion forward now with Sheetal Sharma. As far as climate change is concerned, we've seen some forward movement as far as this G20 summit is concerned as well. They seem to be seem to have put out the right kind of words as far as climate change is concerned. But what about climate action, Sheetal? Because that we've seen, the top nations around the world dragging their feet over the years.
Frank, there are a couple of issues and aspects related to climate change and talking about energy and other issues. And it's not just about equity, it's also about security and sustainability. That aspect also needs to be discussed, because ultimately, if there's any rise in temperature, it is going to affect not just the climate, but also all other things which are related to social, rise of sea levels, economic livelihood, and all these things. So what is very important is to address these three things about equity, about sustainability, and security. And in this particular summit, it's not about security related to energy security or about climate, but also food security, nutrition, and hunger, and all these things were discussed parallelly with other things. But particularly talking about climate change and the role of developed economies or the developed countries is that when we talk about, and there are a couple of Ds involved here, because when we talk about the process of development of developing countries, it requires demand to be fulfilled. And with demand comes, a kind of dependence upon coal. And this dependence has to be done away with, and we have to diversify the basket, energy basket on which these developing countries are dependent. And over a period of time, what has happened that this would succeed only if the developed countries are able to transfer the technology, and the developing countries are able to incentivize the usage of that diversification of energy resources. Now, what can happen here? European Union has been one of the so-called normative actor or the leader in the field of climate change and talking about energy. And what can we do? Actually, can we emulate models but it's very difficult in countries like us. We always talk about going for use of cycles and all these things, but you yourself know that how are we going to cycle, pedal in hot summers here. So what kind of energies are required, what kind of technologies are required in order to combat that? Your goals have to be realistic. Realistic, not in the sense that, okay, you reduce from 2 degree to 1.5 degree or 1.25 degree, but realistic in the sense that they do not hamper the growth and the development process in the developing countries also, because our dependence on energy is going to grow further. And we just cannot also guarantee that by 2050 or 2060s, it would be net zero emissions. Absolutely not in that sense. So we have to be very realistic in terms of what do we commit, how do we commit, and do we actually have a regulatory framework and institutional mechanism in order to execute all that we commit. And this is where the hurdles are there, because there are no initial investors, as Pramit was talking about, that some of the industries are sunset industries, but what is going to be the sunrise industry? Who is going to invest in those areas? And how many takers of that? Because conventionally, it's not just about overnight you have a magic wand and things would change. No, you have to address the questions which are related to diversification, and energy and climate change both go hand in hand. At the same time, as Ambassador Sir was also mentioning about, this pandemic and health security, I would like to bring another thing. No matter what level of development they were, all the countries developed, underdeveloped, developing, everybody faced this pandemic and everyone was caught unaware, in the sense that their infrastructures, the weakness was exposed, and it was so difficult to manage initially. Now, in this case, almost $100 billion commitment has been made in order to develop vaccine and also reduce the period of testing from 300 to 100 days. I think that is what has been committed, that we would be expediting the process of development of vaccine delivery and all these things. So I would say that security, health security, energy security, and climate, three things hold central place in this G20 summit, although it influences different countries within G20 differentially. But then ultimately, and as you were asking in the previous question, multilateralism being put to question as compared to bilateral, notwithstanding the problems with both bilateral as well as the multilateral, I think multilateral does give a kind of platform and a support countries to come together, even if they have their own bilateral issues with one another, or bilaterals may be more, yielding in some cases, but multilateralism will be there.
Absolutely. Pramit, let me bring you in now, and let's talk about this minimum corporate tax that the G20 leaders have decided to go through with, and they want to get it done by 2023. Do you actually see this succeeding? How do you see it going forward?
Well, there are two elements to this tax. One is simply the use of tax havens, corporation moving to the Panamas or Irelands of the world, headquartering themselves there, and then basically funneling all their funding through that. That, which is a cost, probably saves the corporations, the big corporations of the world, about $150 billion. I'm using OECD's figure. Those are going to be shut down. That's the easy part of what's going on here. Because effectively, once the G20, then it starts to spread across the international system, countries will begin to sanction. So Ireland is a tax haven within the European Union. So Ireland will then have to harmonize. It's been fighting for a long time, but it will be forced to harmonize its tax laws with those of the European Union, and therefore automatically, with its present tax rate of about 12%, would have to go up to 15. There'll be a bit more pressure, I think, on smaller little havens, which like the Mauritius and Singapores and stuff. But most of them have already indicated they accept that they're going to have to change this. The more difficult part is the issue of tax of revenues being, should we say, moved back and forth across the world by corporations. So you have example as Facebook operates in India. But until recently, it was not a registered company in India. It was just a registered company overseas. Netflix is a company that did not bother to register in India. They just earned revenue, but then remitted it back to headquarters in some other part of the world, normally in our case, Singapore. So now you're going to have to force these companies. You're doing that already on a bilateral level. The game is, can you now do it on an international level? That will be much more difficult to push through, because that would require a huge amount of governments to change their own laws and requirements. And that in many ways will be really about a collection of bilateral actions with different countries using that leverage to get that through. But the game is that once you have, the OECD already has a framework, and the game is to now slowly push that through the international system and get governments to adopt it, either through legislation or otherwise. But I think what will be good about this is that in some of the disputes between companies and countries and governments now about taxes, the governments will be able to say, look, this is the international standard now. This is accepted by X number of countries. This corporation has no basis to make the claim that it does. That's going to be a longer battle, but now at least it's tilted a little bit more in the favor of the governments. But that's about, again, another $150 billion worth by most estimates that we'd be looking at.
Right. Okay, it's time to get quick closing comments now with the best way forward and what next. Starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, I think just 2 points. First, let me react to what Pramit said. I'm not quite sure how the American Congress will behave, and I wish Pramit gives a kind of a prognosis there, because the American Congress is notorious for, in the past, for not approving what the administrations have done, even if they are path-breaking efforts on the part of the administration. But more than that, as far as the future is concerned, I must confess I'm a little pessimistic. Because my own experience has been that it's yes, as Sheetalji said, it's not only equity, but it's also sustainability and security. But at the end of the day, these are emotional things too. They are not only rational. If the West is unwilling, as it clearly is, to change its lifestyles, then it cannot raise the arguments of sustainability and security when it comes to the developing world. So equity, essentially, especially in these times, the times of colonialism are over. To a large extent, countries assert themselves. So equity does inevitably come into play. And you can't ask for sustainable and secure on a Homo sapien basis unless the big powers are willing to change themselves, and that they're not indicating. So this is not a moral or ethical argument. To me, it's a practical thing. That unless I'm willing to change, how do I ask others to change? They all aspire for the bright lights of America and Europe and Japan. So this has been the crucial and enduring problem, the contradictions that are there, and I don't see any remedy for them in the near future.
Right. Sheetal?
Frank, yes, Ambassador Saab is very right in terms of saying that the West is not ready to compromise upon its style of living, but we just cannot continue to also depend upon when do they do this and when we will start, because we have to also address our issues of survival, sustainability, equity, and then the security. So we have to also have a kind of inborn mechanism in order to deal with the crisis that is looming large. Number two, many of these things, that we have been looking a kind of more impetus upon indigenous industry and more nativist kind of tendencies these days, in the last 2-3 years. We were saying that during the peak of India-China friction last year, there was a kind of stop imports from China and all these things. Despite all that, we were depending greater dependence upon China. So how do we incentivize our industry? How do we promote industry? How do we actually realize the dream of make in India, or actually reduce our import dependence, at least from China for a while? Then we need at least a private sector initiative to come up in the field of climate and energy. If we talk about that, because they have to be given some kind of tax benefits, or say, for example, some kind of investment. These things have to be taken care of, at least at the domestic level. And then everything, no matter it's a question of sustainability or security, it has to have a kind of bottom-up approach. And this involves almost everything. As a sociologist, I would say that, all these things, they tend to influence one another, and right from education system to changing the way people are living their lifestyles, then reducing, recycle, everything, all these philosophies, these practices, they have to be integrated with one another in order to see a cumulative effect of all these actions and ideas coming out. Now, final comment is that the world has to see a greater collaboration and cooperation, at least in the field of health, climate, and energy, and also together address the rest of the issues which are directly, indirectly related to these three areas.
Absolutely. And Pramit, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So yeah, I think the issue about what's the divisions that are taking place in the global economy, it's not about the trade figures, which I don't think are particularly important. You saw China impose trade sanctions on Australia and had to actually lift them after a while because their own economy began to fall apart. They had coal shortages, their steel industry basically said, without Australian iron ore, we can't survive. And the Australians actually saw their trade value figures with China increase by 36% in the past 1 year, despite Chinese sanctions. So it goes both ways. But the real game, and I think you see what's happening in things like the Quad or the EU and so on, is really about standards. And at the heart of this is the digital economy. During the Trump administration, the USTR, when they talked to the Indian side, they said, look, the blueberries and the dairy products, that's the president's interest. The USTR sees the future really about digital standards, data localization, telecom, 5G technology. These are the future of the global economy, not this other stuff that everybody's getting excited about. Those standards, who decides those standards and how they are set, is going to determine the nature and how much splitting there is or factionalism there's going to be in the global economy. And I think there's already very clear. China has virtually thrown out all the American companies. If we go to China, most of our apps in our phone will not work. Our Amazons, our Facebooks, our Twitter, all of those are dead. The same is now true for a Chinese person coming to India. We have literally banned everything. Alibaba, Tencent, all of these companies have basically been largely wiped out or thrown out of the country in India. And there's not slowly happening even slowly in America and a little less in Europe. So you're seeing that split already taking place. India has now put in 5G requirements that effectively are designed to ensure there is no Chinese telecom equipment in this country. And the next step will be to go after Chinese cell phones. You can see the new smartphones that are produced by Reliance and other companies in India are aimed specifically to go after the Xiaomi's and so on. And you can almost certain that the government of India will begin to slowly push the regulatory sphere to slowly push those Chinese firms out. So you're seeing this now spreading across the board. If you look at the techno-alliances strategy that is laid out in the Quad, and then what America is doing domestically, and then what we are doing, whether it's on semiconductor chips to electrical vehicles and batteries, it's very clear the split that's taking place across the planet. Some countries are saying, okay, we'll do a little bit of both. Some countries are trying to be independent. You can see Singapore said, okay, we won't buy Japanese telecom equipment, but we won't buy American telecom equipment. We'll buy Swedish telecom equipment. So we kind of stay, neutral for that time. Those decisions are going to be harder and harder to do over time. And you're starting to now see that spread in the pharmaceutical industry. India's vaccine supply chain has 360 imported components. Not one of them is Chinese today, not one. And that's a deliberate policy.
Right.
And now it's going to be spreading across our pharmaceutical supply chain as we go and do that more and more. So this is going to be something again, and again, the Quad, you can see the lines being laid out about those standards.
Yes, Ambassador, very quickly, last word.
No, I don't want the last word. I mean, that's not my intention. But I see Pramit's point, and I think he's made it very eloquently, and I'm happy that he's made this because he's done it brilliantly. I have two problems here. Even if this world is divided on the basis of digital standards, as he so well put it, where do we stand in this? I don't see any technological investments taking place which will make us a player there. And I'm really worried about that. I mean, we are still, there's all this talk of Macaulay Putras and all the rest. We are now no longer Macaulay Putras. Are we going to be Microsoft Putras?
So, I think if you look at our unicorns, and we now have over 34
come along. Come along. You have faith in unicorns at the moment, I must confess. I will see it when it fructifies and we have even half a Microsoft on the horizon.
Let's give it some time and wait for another day. Maybe it will happen.
Yes, I very much hope it does. I pray that it does. I pray that it does. But I think I'm a little realistic. How much of money are we really investing in research? How much of money has the Chinese invested in research? Pramit follows these things very closely. Let him tell us.
Well, India's R&D, let's keep in mind India's GDP is 1/6 that of China. So we're always going to struggle in the R&D front when compared to China. But keep in mind that, yes, let's say look at semiconductor chips. China has invested $30 billion in semiconductor chip technology. It still can't make a good one. Okay, they're just awful. Taiwan, a tiny little country, is the king of semiconductor chips. 70% of the world's semiconductor chips at the highest level come from a country that of 23 million people. So it's not just about money. It's about the ecosystem you develop. And I would argue, you can see what China is doing. It's literally driving away its billionaires. Its tech billionaires are fleeing the country, transferring money, going to being jailed by the Chinese Communist Party, which seems to believe the state can handle this. In India, I would argue we're moving in the exact opposite direction. We're moving a lot of our tech out of the government. We're freeing up our ecosystem. You talk to an Indian tech, we go to Singapore. I remember many years ago talking to a Singapore minister, and he says, the number of startups we have in Singapore, and half of them are Indians fleeing their country because they say we can't do a startup in India. Today, that number is probably down to about half of what it used to be. We're still an extraordinarily difficult country for entrepreneurship, and we have to change that. I would argue the government is on the right path right now. We're doing much more than we ever did before. But right now, if you want to be a tech entrepreneur, your still tendency is, let me go to California, let me go to Singapore, and let me leave India. That has to change. It's not the money, it's the ecosystem that has to change.
I think that's a very valid point that Pramit is making.
I think it's a wonderful point that Pramit has made, and he's put it very eloquently. I still am pessimistic, but I take note of Pramit's optimism.
And let's all be optimistic. And an optimistic note, we will end the program as well and hope that our companies do well, and I hope our tech ecosystem improves in the immediate near future as well. There are many people working on that front. Let's hope that it picks up pace and goes forward in the right direction. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Well, what's coming out of this discussion is that the G20 is not a monolith. There are schisms in the grouping that are clearly evident. Russia and China staying away from the summit is a worrying factor. There are clear cracks that have emerged, and the world has gone into power blocks again. This scramble for power is very unlike what we witnessed during the Cold War, as times have changed and we are in the digital era. Multilateralism is becoming challenging, but has its utility still. The key focus areas of the summit were a minimum corporate tax deal, health security, and climate change. Well, before I go, let me once again remind you to like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share the video as well so that more people get to know about us. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive information. If you like our content, please contribute to keep it alive. A small contribution that you make will be a giant leap for us to keep bringing you this content. Let me also inform you about Bharata Knowledge Center, your one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. I will be starting live big picture current affairs classes from the 10th of this month, so don't miss the chance to interact with me. Go to kc.bharatafirst.com and register right now. Hundreds are reaping the benefits of the Knowledge Center. Don't be left behind. All this information, along with some must-see recommendations, are in the description of the video. Please go through it. That's it from me. See you again next time.